Thank you, and it's my great pleasure to be here and share with you today. I think what I'm going to do is to start actually at my last slide right now. I mean, I won't show it, but I'll tell you about it because it connects directly with Dr. Gazzetta's findings, and that is in rehabilitation, particularly for severely disabled stroke and traumatic brain injury patients. We are finding that very early rehabilitation after the event, after the injury, with complex activities is what appears to be associated with much better longer-term outcomes. But now I'll show you how we got to those findings and the methodologies that we've used. So first, the title of what I'm going to talk about is how to set up research networks and across a variety of institutions, multi-institutional ones, and what we've done particularly in the area of cerebral palsy. I have no conflicts of interest. This whole methodology derived years ago in the 1980s when clinicians were asking the question, and patients too, of how best to treat the patient that's in front of them at the time. Randomized trials were the only acceptable method at that time, but they felt it provided imperfect guidance because of the limitations that randomized trials have. The difficulty is that clinical medicine, as we all know, is what they call untidy. There are many variables that describe the patients, the providers, the treatments, and the practices. So how are we going to consider all of this variability to determine what is working for whom? So the objectives of my session today are to describe the models we've used to create research, clinical network registries, using methods from comparative effectiveness research, randomized trials, claims databases, electronic medical records, and practice-based evidence study designs. I'll then share with you some examples from practice-based evidence registries related to the quality and safety improvements that we have discovered, and particularly I'm going to show you the things that were surprising to us, and then describe the critical role that I think probably each one of you in the audience would play in such studies, because it's really the frontline clinicians, the patients, and the caregivers, rather than the researchers, that are the ones that lead these types of registries and studies. Just to get us all talking in the same direction, really the research conversation is changing since the 1980s and 90s. We're moving away from researchers asking the only questions that interest them towards asking questions that are important to patients and caregivers. And the answers that matter are changing also. Rather than in past using the clinical measures such as blood pressure or blood test values, et cetera, as being the most important research outcomes, we're moving towards patient-reported outcomes to assess the things that are important to patients and that really improve our quality of life. So that's what has differentiated this patient-centered research for us clinical researchers. Patients and caregivers have unique perspectives to share. And when they do share with us, we have found it increases the relevance of the research questions that we address. It greatly improves the uptake of what we find from these studies. Although the challenges are, it really takes a bit more time to put together such studies. It doesn't take that much more time to collect the data for them. In fact, that becomes part of routine clinical care to collect the data, but it's deciding how to collect it, how to standardize the documentation. What should we be collecting that clearly will make all of us confident that we've described the patient sufficiently, the differences the patients have, we've described their treatments sufficiently, and the outcomes sufficiently, so we'll all know what to do when the findings come out in terms of improving practice. What this Cerebral Palsy Research Network is doing is asking patient-centered research questions that are directly informed by patients and caregivers. And essentially, what we're having to do is to differentiate the two concepts, efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy has been the direction we have gone for most of the career in terms of healthcare. That measures treatment benefits under the best possible circumstances. Can it work in controlled settings? Effectiveness measures the treatment benefit under ordinary practice. Does it work in real-life situations? So we'll be very clear on those two things as we're going through the rest of this discussion. In comparative effectiveness research, we're looking at designing research to inform these healthcare decisions by providing the evidence on the effectiveness, the benefits, and the harms of different treatment options. There are two ways we have gotten evidence for comparative effectiveness research. One is doing systematic reviews of randomized trial data, evidence that exists in the literature now, and the other is to develop new studies, new study databases. We really need both of these, but I'm going to be concentrating on the effectiveness part here. The databases that have been used for effectiveness trials actually in some cases are many existing randomized databases, but also people have used large claims databases. In the United States, the government collects data in order to pay for health care, and the Medicare system for the elderly and the Medicaid system for the poor. Health maintenance organizations and our Veterans Administration have databases also that are based on claims paying for the care, but also some connections with their electronic medical records to describe and document the care that's given. Then there are specific condition registries, such as the Cerebral Palsy Registry we've been developing, and finally, practice-based evidence registries, which we'll spend more time on. Why? Because we found the previous other databases have certain limitations that lead to difficulties in people saying, do I really want to change my care? How can we overcome that? The randomized trial databases, as you know, have been the gold standard for efficacy. And that's because they show us causality. In randomized trials, if you recall how they're done, there usually are a lot of exclusion criteria. You don't want patient factors to be influencing the outcome, so they exclude people who have more serious forms of some diseases or people who have comorbidities that they don't want to affect the outcome. Then they randomize the patients to the treatment or the control. And if there is a difference in outcome, the only thing you can attribute it to is to the treatment, because you've gotten rid of all the other factors that you know about, and you've randomized to get rid of the ones you don't know about. But there are limitations to studies like that, including small sample sizes are used, follow-up periods are often too short, high-risk patients are typically excluded, monitoring is more rigorous, and there are high discontinuation and dropout rates. So people were searching for something else, which is what led them to trying to look at the claims and other databases that existed that cover thousands to millions of patients, provide treatment exposures over extended periods of time so that you can look at population and subpopulation results. But they also have limitations in that they usually don't capture things like the severity of illness of the condition or functional or cognitive status, health behaviors, things of that sort. And many of the variables you want are in text format that are not exportable in terms of putting into research databases. So the types of electronic databases that we've been using for registries include insurance claims databases, the large health systems electronic databases, and then these disease-specific registries. And in particular for the clinical registries, where we systematically collect and store data on a particular disease the characteristics of the patient populations with those diseases, and the treatments that were given, which had the advantages of including details about that specific condition and the treatments given. But limitations are that they're usually a separate add-on to what the other record-keeping system is for those patients, and there's limited information outside the particular disease or condition being studied. So what's the basic problem that we're trying to solve here? When we switch away from randomized trials to looking at observational type data, the big problem is confounding by indication. That means that the therapies are administered in a non-random fashion. The prognostic characteristics of the patient influence what therapy is used. So the recipients of the therapy are usually at higher risk or lower risk of certain outcomes, depending upon what you're doing. In other words, the users differ from the non-users in key aspects. The question is, how can we adjust for this? What can we do? People have been using statistical adjustments, matching, propensity scores. You've probably heard of some of these or read about them, instrumental variables, various covariate adjustments, but there's an ongoing debate about their adequacy. Well, that's where practice-based evidence comes in. So now let me share with you a little bit more about what we did to try to address these issues that were challenging us with observational data. What makes this approach different, and why did we use it to create the Cerebral Palsy Registry that we are now working with in the United States? The issues that we tried to address, first of all, we wanted patients, their caregivers, and clinicians to provide us with the data. We wanted most of the data to come, in fact, all of it eventually, to come from existing medical record systems so that the information used to treat the patient in the medical record system that's required becomes not only the database to decide what the treatments are and describe those treatments, but also becomes the research database that we want to use to discover what works best. But that requires us to agree across sites and providers how we should standardize our data elements. For everything we want to measure, we have to agree on how we're going to measure it, about the patient characteristics, the treatments we're giving, the processes that we're undergoing, what the patients are going to report about and how they're going to describe it, and the multiple other outcomes. The data then become part of routine documentation. It's not an add-on, which is why this is the merging of clinical treatment and research into the same database. That allows us to have rapid patient accrual since the documentation is standard of care. And one big difference is we don't have the same IRB requirements, Institutional Review Board privacy requirements that are required of other kinds of studies when we're changing treatment, because this is using the usual documentation for clinical care, just using it for additional purposes. And the data are longitudinal and ongoing. Patient comparability, to get at this issue of my patients are different, so I'm not sure I believe what the findings are. We have tried to address with one of the parts of it being this comprehensive severity index, which is a disease-specific index that I'll share with you a little more details about in a moment, but it's designed to pick up for every condition the patient has, all the relevant signs and symptoms and how abnormal they are. So when a clinician says to me, what about patients that have A, B, C, D, and E? I know that I'll have them in the database to be able to form such a subpopulation. That's the way we've been addressing the confounding by indication issue. These databases also include all the treatments that are done, including the timing of them, the dose, the intensity, the route. I'll show you an example of that also. And the methods include both drug and non-drug combinations of therapy, so that these registry findings are much more translatable into practice. In essence, when we're doing a practice-based evidence study, we think about it in three boxes of information. On the right-hand side here, you see where we start. The first question we ask of the team that's going to be working in this direction is, what are the things you want to improve? Those are the outcomes we want to get better. Types of things we've studied in the past have been mortality or adverse events, health status at various points in time, motor and cognitive functioning, etc. Then we ask them, what do you think you do to the patients in order to achieve those outcomes? And they can list everything that they do in their process of care, when they do it, etc. We want to get everything documented. When somebody mentions something here and says, I do A, B, and C, nobody asks the question, what's your proof that A, B, and C work? If anybody, our attitude is, if anybody thinks of it as something that might influence the outcome, we'd like to find a way to be able to collect it if they do it. And consequently, not everybody has to do it, but if they do it, we want to be able to get it measured and have a standard way of measuring it. So that includes things like, how are we educating the patients? What are our management strategies? What are our interventions, our surgeries, and all the details about each of those. Then we ask them, okay, how do you describe who you do it to? And that's where the patient box, the lower left-hand corner, comes in, where they describe then what they're doing to the patients, and in great enough detail, so that in the end we can put together combinations of those signs and symptoms for patient groups and then determine what treatments are associated with better outcomes. So the hallmarks of these kinds of registries are decisions about the data elements, and the subsequent analyses are made by the frontline clinicians and patients and their caregivers rather than researchers. This is very much of a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down researcher telling you what to collect and what to do. There's guidance from researchers, but it's really the clinicians and the patients that lead these studies. They're non-experimental data. We follow the outcomes of the treatments actually prescribed, using patient populations undergoing routine clinical care, using actual clinical outcomes, and it turns out they're much less costly to do these kinds of studies than randomized controlled trials. Getting back to our 3 boxes of information, let me tell you a little bit more about the severity of illness measure. When we first started doing these studies back in the 1980s, almost everybody was describing how different patients were with information in that left-hand box there. They took whatever they had in claims data, which was diagnosis and procedure data and demographic data, and they either used a clinical definition of severity. Clinical definitions in those days was mortality, yes or no, or they used a resource definition, that was cost or length of stay. And there were a variety of systems where they would take a specific database, they would model that database to predict either death or cost or length of stay, and then they'd use whatever the predictor significant variables were to say that's how we should categorize patients. The top right-hand box is 2 systems at the time that used a few physiologic elements, not just the diagnosis codes, but they were quite limited. At the time when we were putting this together, I was on the faculty at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, the medical school, and the clinicians there wanted to do a combination of both. They wanted to take diagnosis codes from each of the diagnoses that people were using for diagnosing care in those days, but look at the relevant signs and symptoms for each diagnosis. Not being a physician by training myself, I figured this was going to be a pretty straightforward activity, that we would come up with 50 or 100 different criteria for all the different diseases, and that would be it, and then we would have a very good severity system. Well, 8 years later, after spending much more time than I ever realized was going to be necessary, and I'm developing a much more comprehensive system, we developed what we called the Comprehensive Severity Index to account for this selection bias or confounding by indication. We define severity to be the physiologic complexity presented to medical personnel due to the extent and interactions of patients' diseases. The system was disease-specific. The 19,000 at the time ICD-9 codes now today has been translated over into ICD-10 combinations, but we have about 6,000 today. Different disease clusters, so by the codes that they have, there are some conditions that have similar signs and symptoms. We formed about 6,000 of these different ones, and when you look at the contents of what's in them, there are over 2,200 distinct criteria, subsets of which are used to describe the severity of each disease. So that's what I mean, but you're going to show you later the data from 2 different studies using this system, where when the clinicians came back to me and said, "How do you know, Susan, that the patients are really the same?" I could ask them, "What do you think makes the patients different?" And then they could tell me what they thought made them different, and I would probably have those data elements to look at very specifically because of the detailed way we had been able to get what was describing how sick the patients were. We don't use treatments for criteria. It's comprehensive of all diseases, etc. Things like vital signs, laboratory values, radiology findings, and other physical findings are what we use to describe the patients. And these next 3 slides, I know the type is very small. It's not designed for you to be able to read it all, but just to give you an example, these are the cerebral palsy severity criteria. For pediatrics, the criteria are divided very finely by age. This is for 2 to 4-year-old children, and it collects information about the cardiovascular system, the digestive findings, laboratory values, both chemistry and CSF, spinal fluid, musculoskeletal signs and symptoms, neurologic signs and symptoms, senses, and vital signs. There are quite a few criteria, and this is just one of the thousands of criteria sets we've got to be able to differentiate how severely ill somebody has a primary condition, like in this case cerebral palsy, but we have things for all of their secondary diagnoses also. With that then is a picture of what we call practice-based evidence approaches of collecting the details about the patients, the treatments, and the outcomes. Let me show you some of the things that we've discovered, and particularly the surprising things, in 2 different studies. The first one I select only because it's pediatric, and we're considering child disabilities here, but of course it's not a disabling disease. This was children getting bronchiolitis and being hospitalized with the lung infection bronchiolitis. The average age of these little babies is about 3 months old. So they get this at a very young age, and it's quite severe. They're often hospitalized because they have very severe breathing difficulties. They are turning blue, they're cyanotic, their blood gases are out of line, and so they hospitalize them. And one of the surprising things we found is when should we immunize against them, and I'll tell you more about that. And another one was about when and if we should intubate them. So as an example of how we got to this intubation question, across our 10 teaching children's hospitals that participated in this study, the rate of intubation of bronchiolitis babies ranged from 40% at the high end to 3% at the low end. And so, of course, the people who were from the 40% site said to the people from the 3% site, "You must not have very sick babies, because although you're hospitalizing them and putting them in the intensive care unit, you don't intubate them, whereas we need to intubate a large proportion of our babies." And of course, the people at the 3% site argued back, "We have just as severe babies as you do. So now how are we going to settle this question?" Well, fortunately, we had our severity measure, and I could ask the clinicians, why would you have intubated a baby? And they'd say things like, "The baby stopped breathing, they were apneic." The baby's turning blue, they're cyanotic, their blood gases are out of line, they have severe breathing difficulties. They went through a whole list of the criteria they would use to intubate. What we found was at the 40% site, every baby who had one or more of those signs and symptoms was intubated. At the 3% site, they had lots of babies with those signs and symptoms, but they weren't intubating them. I don't know how many of you have ever treated these babies, but what they were doing instead was tickling their feet, stimulating their feet. And what they could find was almost in every instance, if you stimulated the baby's feet, they would come out of that apneic or cyanotic episode, and you didn't have to intubate them. That made a huge difference in why it even came out in our cost data, because this is the data that was used to trigger that study, and the rest of what we were able to dig down into. But that's the issue. That's the kind of thing you can do when you've got these kinds of detailed data, is be able to see what comes up as a surprise, and then in terms of treatment, and then obviously there are some alternatives if it comes up, because some are doing it and some are not doing it to similar patients. The other thing that has changed practice, if that came out of this study, was at that time, at the time that we collected these data, there was no way to immunize children against bronchiolitis. But a new drug had just come on the market for immunization. It was approved by our Federal Food and Drug Administration, and it was approved only for very premature babies, 32 weeks or less gestational age, because they were considered at the greatest risk. So when they ran the randomized trial, of course, they selected the subgroup that they thought would be most affected by the new vaccination, the new immunization, and found that it was successful in immunizing against bronchiolitis, but it was very expensive. So although the FDA had approved it for very premature 32 weeks or less babies, the insurance companies would only pay for it for very premature babies. But some people wondered, was 32 weeks or less the right gestational age? It had only been selected from somebody's thought process in the randomized trial, not from previous data. We had collected, along with all the other data, anything about the prematurity of the children that had had bronchiolitis. And so we had enough children that were less than 32 weeks, as you see here, 33 to 35 weeks, 36 or 37, or greater than or equal to 37 weeks. And the surprise here was it was really the children who were 33 to 35 weeks that appeared to be, after even controlling for their severity of illness, requiring more or having more intubation, longer intensive care unit length of stay, longer additional hospital length of stay, and more likely being admitted to the intensive care unit. So they were really the most intense in terms of the resource use, and consequently, that ended up changing the guideline for those patients. 33 to 35 week gestational age children had the highest hospital resource use, changed the guidelines to immunizing then children and being willing to have the insurance companies pay for children up to 35 weeks. And also, after about 10 years of trying this, because it was pretty shocking for some people to change from intubating to tickling, but they finally changed the guideline for children with bronchiolitis to saying first try stimulating before you intubate a baby with bronchiolitis. Now to traumatic brain injury, a more recent study that we've done on more than 2,000 patients with traumatic brain injury. When I mentioned to you point of care before and the details about treatments, in this study, they wanted to be sure that, it came about like this. They had done studies to look at, for traumatic brain injury as well as for stroke, what difference did it make if they went to intensive inpatient rehabilitation? And in intensive rehabilitation, you have to have at least 3 hours of care a day. So they looked at the amount of time spent in physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech-language pathology. And they found if people had more or less time spent in physical therapy and any of those therapies after a severe stroke or a severe traumatic brain injury, it made no more difference in explaining the outcomes of where they ended up than just what their patient characteristics were at first. So in other words, the patient characteristics were predicting almost 100% of the outcome. No matter how much time you spent, more or less in rehabilitation, it did not affect the explanatory power of the outcome. So of course the insurance company said, we're not going to pay for it anymore if it's not making any difference. The therapist said, what we do does make a difference. The problem is, it's not how much time we spend overall, it's how much time we spend doing specific activities. And if we can document how much time we're spending on our activities, that will allow us then to ultimately see which ones are associated with better outcomes and which ones are associated with poorer outcomes. Well, they put together, in particular as an example, this form to standardize their documentation of what they did at each therapy session. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at a form like this and I say, oh my goodness, this is going to really disrupt healthcare in terms of having to fill this out after every therapy session. Because the therapists themselves put it together, it took less than 1 minute to fill out this form after each therapy session because they standardized what they were going to describe. They knew exactly how they wanted the format so they could fill it out very quickly. It was put into a computer format subsequently. And we received over 350,000 of these in this study. And it didn't disrupt healthcare in any way as a result. That's what you've got to work for in terms of putting together these registries. So did it make a difference that they documented this? Well, here's a little statistics for you quickly. The top line here, first of all, we took these 2,100 patients and divided them into the most severely damaged brain injury and less damage, less damage, less damage, and least damage in the rehabilitation settings. How much did the patient variables and the injury variables explain? The least amount in the most damaged group, the most amount in the least damaged group here. How much more if we looked at the amount of time they spent in each of the therapists, total, not by specific activities? Almost no increase in the explanatory power of their discharge functioning or of any of the outcomes. This is just one example. But look at what happened if we instead looked at how much time was spent on specific activities. It greatly increased the explanatory power, particularly for the most severely ill patients. A little bit less in terms of the differences for the less severely damaged patients. What does that tell you? That tells you that you're going to be able to find certain treatments associated with better outcomes and other treatments associated with poorer outcomes, so you stop doing those and you do more of the other. I'm going to skip by the details of what was better just to summarize at a very high level. Again, we found what the previous presenter was telling you. The sooner you get into treatment, the better. Shorter time from injury to rehabilitation admission was associated with better functional and cognitive outcomes. And the more time spent in complex activities like advanced gait, stairs, problem solving, money management in particular, instrumental activities of daily living, things like that, at the beginning of the stay, bypassing all the less complex activities was what was associated with better functional and cognitive outcomes in the end. So in summary, this practice-based evidence methodology provides us with a structured way to design registries for patients in routine care settings, balancing between a population approach and an individual decision-making approach. We get comprehensive data about patients' treatments and outcome differences, and the findings associated with better outcomes are very easily transferable for use in other sites because all patients are included. So that's the concept that we use to put together our cerebral palsy research network database and registry that we're going to be subsequently analyzing to find out what's best and when for cerebral palsy patients. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting presentation and for showing us the possibilities that we have aside from the randomized controlled trials. So the floor is open for questions. Are there any questions from the audience?
Osmani Psiroglu, Vancouver. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It's very encouraging to listen to you. At the end, when I translate it in clinical practice, my understanding is you are suggesting a dynamic registry with incentives for parents or caregivers. And it makes, the idea is very attractive because they feed in data and they get the results directly, right?
That is actually what we find, that it's a very easy thing to tell parents that something like this is available for them and to get them to be willing to participate with us and document with us because they want to find out what should they do for their child. It's really quite amazing. It's not like you have to persuade them very often in a randomized trial circumstance. This is a circumstance where, well, I find it very easy because, as I mentioned, they want to find out what's the best thing to do. So they're very willing to help us do the definitions and then also ask the questions. And they ask very different questions than we usually do as researchers, but it helps us to be able to come up with and discover what are those things that are really best for us to be doing, but we may not have realized it.
How do you monitor data quality? Is the first question. Data quality. Data quality.
Data quality?
Right. That's the first question. And the second question is?
It's the best you can do. Is it perfect? Probably not. Will we get better over time? Yes. But the data quality that they help define what the data elements are going to be, we often have what we call a help function, which really is just a little description of what we're asking for, so giving them several possibilities of how they could answer things there, and then usually have drop-down screens that contain all the different variables, or there's an other where they can add something in if they don't feel anything that's on the list already on the drop-down screen describes how they want to answer that question. But because they've been involved, just like the point of care form that I just showed you for physical therapy, as they've been involved in the process of putting it together, and you have people from across the country helping in that process, you get lots of different ideas from the beginning. So most of the things that are going to come up, you've already had somebody suggest and a way to describe it that people are comfortable with to be able to use subsequently. That's how it works.
Thank you very much. I'm Karen Horridge from the north of England. I really enjoyed your talk, and it resonated very much with the work that we've been doing in England in trying to develop a system for translating data captured at the point of care into usable and useful data for designing systems. I'm interested in, do you code the Comprehensive Severity Index, and what coding system do you use? And does the Comprehensive Index include elements of environmental and family reported factors such as family issues, school issues, equipment issues, access to leisure issues, the broader issues in the environment, as well as the very clinical issues?
Well,
can you give a short answer?
Yes. Okay. CSI is actually more clinically oriented. Those other variables we get outside of the CSI, but collect them because they're very important in terms of influencing the outcomes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. In sake of time,